I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sitting quietly in your living room after a long day. Maybe you're tucked away in a small kitchen. Or perhaps you're watching over a child who isn't yours, carrying a quiet love that no one sees. It doesn't matter what time it is or where you are, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart in a way you didn't expect. This is the story of a woman named Clara, a nanny whose hands told stories far deeper than words ever could. A woman whose presence was like the steady pulse of life within a cold, luxurious mansion perched high on the hills of San Francisco. She was a ghost to the world around her, a silent shadow moving between opulence and emptiness, between marble floors that echoed with loneliness and crystal chandeliers that cast light but no warmth. Clara Martinez had weathered hands that spoke of years spent folding tiny clothes, braiding small hair, and wiping away tears that weren't her own. Her eyes held the kind of sadness that comes from loving without being loved back, from giving without receiving, from being essential yet invisible. But behind those weary brown eyes and those calloused fingers was a melody, both on the piano and in her soul, that would crack the walls of pride, ignorance, and silence that surrounded the Carmichael family. The morning fog rolled in from the bay, as it always did, wrapping around the towering windows of the Carmichael estate like a familiar embrace. Inside, the house breathed with the rhythm of wealth, polished hardwood floors that gleamed under imported Italian light fixtures, walls adorned with original paintings worth more than most people's annual salaries, and rooms so vast they seemed to swallow sound itself. This was a home built on success, on a fortune accumulated through years of shrewd investments in cryptocurrency, particularly Bitcoin, and a tech empire that generated millions in cash flow annually. Yet for all its grandeur, it remained hollow, like a beautiful shell washed up on an empty shore. Clara moved through this opulent maze with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself small. At 52, she carried herself with a dignity that poverty and loss had failed to break. Her graying hair was always pulled back neatly. Her simple uniform, a modest gray dress and comfortable shoes, was always clean and pressed. She had been with the Carmichael family for 5 years now, 5 years of watching children grow while remaining forever on the periphery of their lives. George Carmichael was the kind of man who measured everything in dollars and cents. His net worth exceeded $30 million, built from a combination of tech investments, stock market acumen, and an early bet on cryptocurrency that had paid off handsomely. His business portfolio included stakes in 3 major companies, real estate investments spanning from downtown San Francisco to Napa Valley, and a diverse asset portfolio that most financial advisors could only dream of managing. But for all his financial intelligence, George remained emotionally bankrupt, unable to translate his love for his children into anything more meaningful than expensive toys and elite private school tuitions. His wife, Margaret, had died 3 years earlier in a car accident, leaving behind 2 children who barely remembered the sound of her laughter. 7-year-old Ella had inherited her mother's delicate features, but carried a sadness in her green eyes that seemed too heavy for such a young face. 3-year-old Jamie was all energy and curiosity, a small tornado of questions and giggles who still sometimes called for "Mama" in his sleep, breaking Clara's heart every time. Clara had come to the Carmichael household 5 years ago, when Margaret was still alive but already withdrawn, struggling with depression that wealth couldn't cure. Even then, Clara had been more than a nanny. She'd been a quiet anchor in a house that was slowly drowning in its own emotional emptiness. When Margaret died, Clara's role had expanded beyond childcare. She became the keeper of routines, the guardian of stability, the one constant in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. But George saw her only as an employee, a necessary expense in his carefully managed household budget. To him, Clara's salary was just another line item, her presence as unremarkable as the gardener who tended the estate's manicured lawns or the housekeeper who maintained its pristine appearance. He failed to notice how Ella's nightmares stopped when Clara sang soft Spanish lullabies, learned from her own grandmother, how Jamie's tantrums dissolved under her patient touch, how the very atmosphere of the house seemed lighter when she hummed while folding laundry. The truth was that Clara had never intended to become a nanny. She had been a music teacher once, in a different life that seemed like someone else's dream now. She had been married to Roberto, a gentleman who worked construction and played guitar on weekends. They had lived in a small apartment in the Mission District, where the walls were thin but the love was thick, where neighbors knew each other's names and shared meals when times were tough. Clara had taught piano lessons to neighborhood children, watching their faces light up when they finally mastered a difficult piece, feeling fulfilled in a way that money couldn't buy. But life has a way of rewriting our stories without our permission. Roberto died of a heart attack at 43, leaving Clara with nothing but memories and a grief so profound it seemed to have weight. They had never been able to have children, a sorrow they had learned to carry together, supporting each other through the holiday seasons when other families gathered and they sat quietly with their shared dreams of what might have been. After Roberto's death, Clara had spent months adrift, playing piano in her empty apartment until the neighbors complained, crying until her tears seemed to run out. She had taken the nanny position partly out of financial necessity. Roberto's life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses, but mostly because she couldn't bear the silence of her own life anymore. Children's laughter, even if it wasn't meant for her, was better than the hollow echo of her own heartbeat in an empty house. The morning Clara first walked through the Carmichael mansion's front door, she was struck by how much space two small children occupied and how little life filled the remaining rooms. Margaret had been kind but distant, discussing schedules and rules with the detached efficiency of someone managing a business rather than a home. George had barely looked up from his laptop when Clara was introduced, offering a perfunctory handshake before returning to a phone call about stock dividends and investment returns. But Ella and Jamie, they were different. They were hungry for attention, for connection, for someone who would see them not as obligations to be managed, but as tiny human beings with hearts full of wonder and need. Clara recognized that hunger because she carried it too. And from the first moment she knelt down to Ella's eye level and really listened to her concerns about starting a new school, something magical began to happen. Clara threw herself into caring for the children with the devotion of a mother protecting her cubs. She learned that Ella was afraid of thunderstorms and loved stories about brave princesses, that Jamie had an obsession with construction trucks, and could identify the difference between a backhoe and an excavator from across a construction site. She discovered that both children had inherited their mother's love of music, but had never been encouraged to explore it, that the beautiful grand piano in the living room was nothing more than an expensive piece of furniture gathering dust. It was the piano that became Clara's secret solace, and eventually her greatest vulnerability. After the children were asleep and George was locked away in his home office reviewing quarterly reports and cryptocurrency market trends, Clara would sometimes steal moments at the keyboard. Her fingers would find their way to melodies that Roberto had loved, to lullabies she had planned to sing to children she would never have, to compositions that poured out of her like prayers whispered in the dark. The piano bench became her confessional, the keys her congregation. She played softly, always aware that she was trespassing on something that didn't belong to her, but unable to resist the pull of music that had been her first love, her truest language. Sometimes Ella would creep down the stairs and listen from the hallway, her small hand pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with wonder at this magical side of Clara she had never seen. Jamie, still so young, would sometimes wake to the distant sound of melody and fall back asleep with a smile. Though he never understood why his dreams were suddenly full of music. But George heard the piano too, and to him, those gentle melodies were nothing more than an intrusion, a violation of the carefully ordered world he had constructed around his grief. The first time he confronted Clara about it, she had been playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had always reminded her of rain on windows and the comfort of home. She heard his sharp footsteps on the marble floor before she saw him, but her hands were reluctant to leave the keys, as if the music itself was pleading for just a few more moments of life. "Clara." His voice cut through the melody like a blade through silk. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" She turned slowly, her hands falling to her lap like broken wings. George stood in the doorway. His tie loosened from another late night of managing his financial empire, his face wearing the expression of a man unaccustomed to having his authority questioned, even silently. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carmichael. I thought the children were asleep and you just thought you could treat my home like your personal concert hall?" His words were measured but sharp, each one calculated to remind her of her place in his carefully structured world. "I pay you to take care of my children, not to indulge in whatever musical fantasies you might have. This is a working household, not a conservatory." Clara's cheeks burned with shame and disappointment. She had been foolish to think that her music might be welcome here, foolish to believe that the beauty she created could somehow bridge the gap between her station and theirs. She closed the piano bench with a soft click that seemed to echo through the room like a door closing forever. "Yes, sir. It won't happen again." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she spoke them with the quiet dignity that had carried her through so many disappointments. "I apologize for overstepping." George watched her walk away, her shoulders straight despite the weight of humiliation she carried. For a moment, something flickered across his face, perhaps regret, perhaps recognition of his own harshness, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He had more important things to think about: market volatility, upcoming board meetings, investment opportunities that could increase his portfolio value by millions. The silence that followed Clara's departure should have felt like victory, but instead, it felt strangely empty. From that night forward, the piano remained silent. Clara performed her duties with the same quiet efficiency, but something had dimmed in her eyes, some spark of joy that had briefly illuminated the corners of the house. She still sang lullabies to the children, but only in whispers now, only when she was certain George was nowhere near. The music that had once filled the empty spaces of the mansion retreated into the secret chambers of her heart, where it played on in muted tones, like a radio with the volume turned down. Winter settled over San Francisco with unusual severity that year, bringing with it a series of storms that rattled the mansion's windows and sent fog rolling through the streets like ghostly fingers. The city's famous hills became treacherous with rain, and the bay churned with whitecaps that caught the light from the Golden Gate Bridge like scattered diamonds. Inside the Carmichael house, the heating system worked overtime to combat the chill, but no amount of warmth could chase away the coldness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It was during one of these storms, on a night when the rain drummed against the windows like impatient fingers, that everything changed. Clara had just finished reading Ella a bedtime story, a tale about a little girl who discovered she could speak to animals, when she heard the first cry from down the hall. It was Jamie's voice, but something in it made her blood run cold. This wasn't his usual bedtime fussing or his common requests for water or another story. This was the cry of a child in distress, raw and desperate in a way that cut straight through her heart. She found him in his room, burning with fever and barely conscious. His small body was racked with chills despite the warmth of his covers, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Clara's nursing instincts, honed through years of caring for children and learned during Roberto's final illness, kicked in immediately. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the dangerous heat radiating from his skin, saw the way his eyes rolled back unfocused, recognized the signs of a medical emergency that could turn deadly within hours. "Ella," she called, her voice carrying the authority of crisis. "Come here, sweetheart. I need you to help me." The 7-year-old appeared in the doorway, her own face pale with fear as she took in the sight of her little brother's condition. Clara was already moving with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies and making mental calculations about symptoms and treatments. "I need you to run to your father's office and tell him to call 911 immediately," Clara said, her voice calm despite the panic rising in her chest. "Tell him Jamie has a high fever and we need an ambulance. Can you do that for me?" Ella nodded and ran down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold marble floor. Clara could hear her pounding on George's office door, could hear the urgency in her small voice as she delivered the message. Within moments, George was running down the hallway, his face a mask of terror as he took in the scene in Jamie's room. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice breaking with fear. "He was fine when I said goodnight." He was laughing and asking for one more story. "Children can get sick very quickly," Clara said, never taking her eyes off Jamie as she monitored his breathing. "I think it might be pneumonia, but we need to get him to a hospital immediately. The ambulance is coming, but we need to keep him comfortable until they arrive." She had already stripped him down to his diaper to help bring his temperature down, had positioned him to make breathing easier, had done everything she could with the limited resources of a bedroom. George stood helplessly beside the bed, his millions of dollars in business acumen useless in the face of his child's illness. All his wealth, all his carefully managed investments in cryptocurrency holdings couldn't buy him the knowledge and instinct that Clara possessed in this moment. "What can I do?" he asked, and for the first time since Clara had known him, his voice was small and uncertain. "Hold his hand," she said simply. "Talk to him. Let him know you're here." As they waited for the ambulance, Clara maintained a steady stream of calm reassurance, checking Jamie's pulse and temperature, adjusting his position when his breathing became labored, singing soft lullabies in Spanish that seemed to soothe him even in his semi-conscious state. George watched her work with growing amazement, seeing for the first time the depth of skill and intuition that she brought to caring for his children. When the paramedics arrived, Clara was able to provide them with detailed information about Jamie's symptoms, the timeline of his illness, and her observations about his condition. She rode with them in the ambulance, holding Jamie's small hand while George followed in his car, the rain streaming down his windshield like tears. At the hospital, as doctors confirmed Clara's suspicion of pneumonia and began aggressive treatment, George found himself watching her with new eyes. She stayed by Jamie's bedside throughout the long night, monitoring his breathing, alerting nurses to changes in his condition, providing the kind of vigilant care that no amount of money could buy. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair had escaped its neat arrangement, but she never faltered, never complained, never suggested that this crisis fell outside her job description. "You saved his life," George said quietly as dawn began to break over the city, painting the hospital windows with pale gold light. Jamie's fever had finally broken, and his breathing had returned to normal. The doctor said he would make a full recovery, but it had been a close call. Clara looked up from where she sat beside the small hospital bed, her eyes red from exhaustion, but bright with relief. "I just did what anyone would do," she said, but George shook his head. "No," he said, and his voice carried a weight of recognition that surprised them both. "Not anyone. You knew exactly what to do, exactly how to help him. You probably prevented brain damage or worse." For the first time since she had come to work for the Carmichaels, Clara saw something in George's eyes that looked like respect, like genuine gratitude. It was a small crack in the wall between employer and employee, between the wealthy businessman and the humble nanny. But it was a beginning. As spring arrived in San Francisco, bringing with it the city's famous wildflowers and the return of tourists to Fisherman's Wharf, something had shifted in the dynamic of the Carmichael household. George still worked long hours managing his investment portfolio and overseeing his business interests, still spent evenings reviewing market reports and cryptocurrency trends, but he paid attention now in ways he hadn't before. He noticed how Jamie ran to Clara when he scraped his knee, how Ella saved her best artwork to show her first, how both children seemed to glow under her patient attention and genuine interest in their lives. He began to see the small miracles she performed daily, the way she could calm tantrums with a few whispered words in Spanish, how she made ordinary moments magical with improvised games and stories, how she seemed to anticipate the children's needs before they even expressed them. When Ella struggled with math homework, Clara would sit with her for hours, finding creative ways to make numbers make sense. When Jamie had nightmares, Clara would appear at his bedside as if summoned by maternal instinct, ready with comfort and reassurance. But it was during one of those quiet evening moments, when the fog was rolling in from the bay and the house was settling into its nighttime rhythms, that George truly began to understand the depth of Clara's devotion. He had been working late in his office when he heard it, the faint sound of piano music drifting through the house like a whisper from another world. His first impulse was anger. Hadn't he made it clear that the piano was off limits? But as he moved toward the sound, something in the melody stopped him cold. It wasn't the classical pieces she had played before, nothing he recognized from concerts or recordings. This was something raw and personal, a composition that seemed to pour straight from her heart onto the keys. He found her at the piano, but she wasn't alone. Ella sat beside her on the bench, her small fingers following Clara's across the keys, learning a simple melody. Jamie sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, building a tower of blocks in time to the music. The scene was so tender, so natural, that George felt like an intruder in his own home. Clara was teaching Ella a lullaby, something she said her own grandmother had sung to her when she was small. Her voice was soft and sweet, carrying words in Spanish that George couldn't understand, but that seemed to transport the children to some magical place where music and love intertwined. This wasn't the violation of his household rules that he had expected to find. This was a family scene more beautiful than any he could have imagined. The words mean, "Sleep, little star," Clara was explaining to Ella. "My abuela used to tell me that every child has a star watching over them, and when you sing this song, your star moves closer to keep you safe through the night." Ella's eyes were wide with wonder. "Do I have a star, Clara?" "Oh yes, mija. You have the brightest star in the sky, and it's been waiting your whole life for you to notice it." George retreated to his office without announcing his presence. But he couldn't concentrate on the financial reports spread across his desk. The image of Clara at the piano, surrounded by his children's rapt attention, had lodged itself in his mind like a seed. For the first time, he began to question not what Clara was doing wrong, but what he might be missing right. The breakthrough came on a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. George had planned to spend the day reviewing investment opportunities. Bitcoin was experiencing another surge, and his financial advisors were recommending strategic moves that could significantly increase his net worth. But Jamie had other ideas. The 3-year-old appeared in George's office wearing his favorite dinosaur t-shirt and carrying a small wooden piano toy that Clara had bought him at a second-hand store. "Daddy, want to hear my song?" Jamie asked, his face beaming with the innocent confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned that his interests might not be shared by everyone around him. George looked up from his computer screen, where cryptocurrency charts and stock market analyses competed for his attention. His first instinct was to postpone this interruption until later, to suggest that Jamie show his song to Clara instead. But something in his son's expectant expression stopped him. "Of course," George said, closing his laptop and giving Jamie his full attention for perhaps the first time in months. "I'd love to hear your song." Jamie settled onto the floor and began to play his toy piano, his small fingers producing a tinkling melody that was surprisingly coherent. But more than the music itself, it was the joy on Jamie's face that caught George's attention. This wasn't just random noise-making. This was a child expressing something important, something that Clara had nurtured and encouraged. "Clara taught me," Jamie explained proudly. "She says music is like colors for your ears, and every person has different colors inside them." As George listened to his son's enthusiastic explanation of musical concepts that he himself had never considered, he realized that Clara had been giving his children something he didn't even know they needed. She wasn't just keeping them fed and safe. She was helping them discover parts of themselves, encouraging interests and talents that might have otherwise remained hidden. That evening, George found Clara in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. She was humming softly to herself as she worked, the same lullaby he had heard her teaching Ella. Her movements were efficient but unhurried, and there was something peaceful about her presence that seemed to make the large kitchen feel more like home and less like a showplace. "Clara," he said, and she turned with a slight start, as if she hadn't expected to find him there. "I wanted to thank you for what you're doing with the children, the music lessons, I mean. I can see how much they enjoy it." Clara's face showed surprise and wariness in equal measure. After the previous confrontation about the piano, she had been careful to limit musical activities to times when George wasn't around, but she hadn't been able to resist Jamie's enthusiasm for learning. "I hope it's not a problem," she said carefully. "I know you prefer quiet in the house, and I try to keep it down." "It's not a problem," George interrupted, and he meant it. "In fact, I'd like to understand better what you're teaching them. I never learned music myself, and I don't want to miss something important about who they're becoming." This was as close to an apology as Clara had ever received from him, and she recognized the significance of the gesture. George Carmichael was not a man accustomed to admitting he might be wrong or that someone else might have insight he lacked. The fact that he was asking about her methods rather than simply forbidding them marked a fundamental shift in their relationship. "Music teaches them about emotion," Clara explained, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke about something she was passionate about. "When Ella plays a sad song, she learns that it's okay to feel sad sometimes. When Jamie makes up happy songs, he's learning to celebrate joy. It's not just about the notes, it's about giving them a way to understand their own hearts." George found himself listening with genuine interest as Clara described her philosophy of music education, her belief that every child had a unique voice waiting to be discovered, her conviction that creativity was as important as academic achievement. She spoke about his children with such insight, such detailed understanding of their individual personalities and needs, that he realized she knew them better in some ways than he did. Summer in San Francisco brought the usual parade of tourists and the fog that rolled in from the Pacific like clockwork every afternoon. The Carmichael house, with its panoramic view of the bay and the city sprawling below, seemed to float above it all like a ship anchored in the sky. But inside, the atmosphere had warmed considerably. George had begun joining the family for dinner more often, listening as Ella and Jamie chattered about their days, their lessons with Clara, their discoveries about music and themselves. Clara bloomed under this new attention, this acknowledgement that her contributions to the household went beyond basic childcare. She began to share more of herself, telling stories about her childhood in Mexico City, teaching the children simple phrases in Spanish, cooking traditional dishes that filled the house with the warm sense of cumin and cilantro. The mansion, once cold and echoing, began to feel like a place where people actually lived, where laughter was welcome and small joys were celebrated. It was during this golden period, when everything seemed to be settling into a new and better rhythm, that Clara finally found the courage to share the deepest part of her story. It came about naturally, during one of those quiet evening moments when the children were in their pajamas, and the three of them were gathered around the piano for their nightly music session. Ella had been practicing a simple piece, but her small fingers kept stumbling over a particular passage. She was getting frustrated, her lower lip trembling with the effort of holding back tears. "I can't do it," she said, her voice small and defeated. "It's too hard." Clara pulled Ella onto her lap, holding her with the tenderness of someone who understood the weight of disappointment. "When I was learning this piece," she said softly, "I had someone very special helping me. Should I tell you about him?" Both children nodded eagerly. They loved Clara's stories, but she had never shared much about her life before she came to them. As Clara began to speak, her voice took on a quality that George, listening from the hallway, had never heard before, a mixture of love and loss so profound it seemed to change the very air in the room. "His name was Miguel," Clara said, her fingers absently playing the melody that Ella had been struggling with. "He was my little boy, and he would have been about Jamie's age now." The children listened with the solemn attention that children reserve for truly important information. Even Jamie, usually bouncing with energy, sat perfectly still. Miguel loved music more than anything in the world, Clara continued. When he was very small, smaller even than you, Jamie, he would dance to any sound, the washing machine, the microwave beeping, even the sound of rain on the windows. He heard rhythm everywhere. Clara's hands moved across the keys, playing a melody that was both beautiful and heartbreaking, something that seemed to contain all the love and longing of a mother's heart. When Miguel got sick, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I would play for him every day. Even when he was too tired to dance, he would smile when he heard music. The doctor said it helped him feel better, even when the medicine couldn't help anymore. Ella had wrapped her small arms around Clara's waist, and Jamie had moved closer, sensing the sadness in her voice, even if he didn't fully understand the story. Miguel went to heaven when he was 3 years old, Clara said, finally speaking the truth she had carried alone for so many years. But before he left, he made me promise something. He made me promise that I would keep playing music, keep sharing it with other children, because he said that's how he would always be able to hear it. The room was completely silent, except for the soft sound of Clara's fingers on the keys, playing a lullaby that she had once sung to her own child. Every time I teach you a song, every time I hear you making music, I know that Miguel is listening too, Clara said, looking down at both children with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears. That's why I love teaching you, why music makes me so happy, even when it makes me sad too. Because love doesn't stop, even when someone goes to heaven. It just finds new ways to grow. From the hallway, George felt his own eyes fill with tears. He had spent 5 years thinking of Clara as simply an employee, someone whose job it was to care for his children in exchange for her monthly salary. He had never considered that she might have her own dreams, her own losses, her own profound reasons for the devotion she showed his family. The realization hit him with the force of revelation. Clara wasn't just working in his house, she was healing in it, finding ways to honor her own lost child by loving his children. Later that night, after the children were asleep and Clara had retired to her small room on the 3rd floor, George sat alone in his office, staring at financial reports he couldn't concentrate on. The numbers that usually commanded his complete attention, stock prices, profit margins, cryptocurrency values, seemed suddenly meaningless in the face of what he had witnessed. Clara's story had cracked something open in his chest, some protective shell he had built around his own grief after Margaret's death. He thought about his wife, about the music she had loved and the piano that had been silent since her death. Margaret had been a talented pianist, and she had talked about teaching Ella and Jamie when they were older. But after the accident, George had been too consumed with grief and the practicalities of single parenthood to think about music lessons or creative expression. He had focused on what he knew, providing for his children's future through careful financial planning, ensuring their security through investments in savings accounts and college funds. But Clara had shown him what he had missed, the importance of nurturing not just his children's bodies and minds, but their hearts and souls. She had taken on the role that Margaret might have played, not as a replacement, but as a guardian of the musical legacy that might have been lost forever. For the first time in years, George found himself thinking about his own childhood, about the disconnect between him and his workaholic father, about promises he had made to himself to be more present for his own children. Somehow, in the rush to build financial security for his family, he had recreated the same emotional distance he had once resented in his own father. The fall months brought a new rhythm to the Carmichael household, one that seemed to revolve around music and laughter and small celebrations of daily life. George had begun working shorter hours, coming home for dinner more often, even requesting that Clara teach him some basic piano skills so he could participate in the evening music sessions. His clumsy attempts at simple melodies delighted the children and seemed to amuse Clara, who proved to be a patient teacher, even when her student was a millionaire CEO who was more comfortable with complex financial instruments than with finding middle C on a keyboard. The transformation wasn't just in George's behavior. The entire house seemed different. Clara had been given permission to decorate the children's rooms with artwork and musical posters, and the sound of practice sessions and impromptu concerts had become as much a part of the household routine as morning coffee and bedtime stories. Ella had progressed remarkably on the piano, and Jamie had developed an ear for rhythm that impressed even Clara. More importantly, both children were happier, more confident, more comfortable expressing themselves both musically and emotionally. George found himself looking forward to coming home in ways he hadn't since Margaret's death. The house that had once felt like a mausoleum now pulsed with life and warmth. Clara's influence had spread beyond the children to touch every aspect of domestic life. She had introduced family traditions like Sunday morning pancakes with Mexican hot chocolate. She had organized the children's rooms to encourage creativity and play. She had even convinced George to let her plant a small garden in the backyard where Ella and Jamie could grow flowers and vegetables. But perhaps most importantly, Clara had helped George reconnect with his children in meaningful ways. She would suggest activities they could do together, facilitate conversations about their interests and dreams, and gently encourage George to share his own memories and experiences. Under her subtle guidance, he began to see his role not just as a provider, but as an active participant in their emotional and creative development. It was during this time of growing closeness that George made what he thought was a generous gesture. Clara's birthday was approaching, and he wanted to do something special to acknowledge not just her service to the family, but her profound impact on all their lives. He had been thinking about the way she always spoke about Miguel, about how music had been their connection, and he had an idea that he thought would touch her heart. George commissioned a local artist to create a portrait of Clara at the piano, surrounded by musical notes and butterflies, with a small figure of a child listening from among the clouds. It was meant to honor both her love of music and her connection to Miguel, a way of acknowledging the son she had lost and the motherly love she had given to his children. The painting was beautiful, executed with skill and sensitivity, and George was proud of his thoughtfulness in creating such a personal gift. The presentation took place during a family dinner, with Ella and Jamie helping to unveil the portrait, while George explained its symbolism. He spoke about Clara's dedication to their family, about the music she had brought into their lives, and about his desire to honor the memory of Miguel through this artistic tribute. He expected tears of gratitude, expressions of appreciation for his recognition of her sacrifices. Instead, Clara's face went pale, and her hands began to tremble. The portrait, beautiful as it was, represented a fundamental misunderstanding that struck her like a physical blow. George had created a romanticized version of her tragedy, turning her most private pain into a decorative object for his walls. The artist had painted Miguel as an angel figure, complete with wings and a halo, transforming her real child, her funny, energetic, music-loving little boy, into a sanctified image that bore no resemblance to the living child she remembered. Moreover, the painting depicted her as she was now, in the Carmichael house, with Miguel watching from heaven as she cared for other people's children. To George, this might have seemed like a beautiful representation of continuity and love transcending death. To Clara, it felt like her private grief had been appropriated, turned into something meant to make others feel good about her sacrifice, rather than truly understanding her loss. "It's beautiful," she managed to say, her voice carefully controlled. "Thank you for thinking of Miguel." But George, in his enthusiasm to finally acknowledge Clara's importance to the family, missed the subtle signs of her discomfort. He saw only what he expected to see: gratitude, appreciation, perhaps even tears of joy. He hung the portrait in the living room, where visitors could admire his thoughtfulness and where Clara would be reminded daily of his gesture. What George didn't understand was that Clara's grief was not something to be celebrated or displayed. Miguel's memory lived in the private moments when she heard his laughter and other children's giggles, when she played the songs he had loved, when she felt his presence in the quiet spaces of her heart. The public display of her loss, no matter how well-intentioned, felt like a violation of something sacred. The painting became a wedge between them, a symbol of the fundamental gap in understanding that still existed despite the progress they had made. Clara continued to perform her duties with the same devotion, continued to love and nurture Ella and Jamie, but something had shifted. She became more careful about sharing personal stories, more reserved about letting George see the depths of her emotional investment in the family. George sensed the change, but misinterpreted its cause. He thought perhaps Clara was overwhelmed by his generosity, that she needed time to process such a meaningful gift. He found himself watching her more carefully, looking for signs that his gesture had brought them closer, that his acknowledgement of her sacrifice had deepened their connection. Instead, the distance between them began to grow again, subtle but unmistakable. Clara still laughed with the children, still filled the house with music and warmth, but she had retreated behind the professional boundaries that George had thought they were finally moving beyond. The easy conversations about music and children and life had become more formal, more careful. Clara was protecting herself, though George couldn't understand from what. The winter months brought an unusual darkness to the Carmichael house, one that seemed to seep in despite Clara's best efforts to maintain the warmth and joy she had cultivated throughout the fall. The portrait hung in the living room like a constant reminder of good intentions gone wrong, its bright colors and angelic imagery standing in stark contrast to the growing tension that no one could quite name or address. Clara continued her duties with unwavering devotion, but there was a carefulness in her interactions with George now, a subtle stepping back from the intimacy that had been developing. She still sang lullabies to the children, still taught them piano and shared stories from her childhood, but she kept her deeper sorrows to herself. The spontaneous moments of connection that had been blossoming between all four members of the household became rarer, replaced by a more formal politeness that satisfied no one. George threw himself back into his work with increased intensity, perhaps sensing that he had damaged something precious, but not understanding what or how. His investment portfolio was performing exceptionally well. Bitcoin had reached new heights, his stock market positions were generating substantial returns, and his overall net worth had increased by several $1,000,000 over the past year. But financial success felt hollow when measured against the growing coldness in his own home. The children, sensitive to the emotional undercurrents in the house, began to exhibit signs of stress. Ella's piano practice became less enthusiastic, and she started having trouble sleeping. Jamie reverted to some of the tantrums and attention-seeking behaviors that Clara had helped him outgrow. Both children seemed confused by the subtle but unmistakable change in the adults around them. The way conversations stopped when they entered rooms, the careful politeness where there had once been easy warmth. It was Ella who finally gave voice to what everyone was feeling, but no one was addressing. During one of their evening music sessions, she looked up at Clara with serious 7-year-old eyes and asked, "Are you sad, Clara? You seem different lately." Clara's hands stilled on the piano keys. She had been trying so hard to maintain normalcy for the children's sake, to not let her discomfort with George's gift affect her relationship with Ella and Jamie. But children see everything, feel everything, and Ella's innocent question cut straight to the heart of the matter. "I'm not sad, Misha," Clara said carefully, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings, and it takes time to work through them." "Is it because of the picture?" Ella asked, and Clara's breath caught. "I heard Daddy talking to someone on the phone about how much it cost, and I saw you looking at it sometimes with a scary face." Out of the mouths of babes. Ella had identified the source of the tension with the clarity that only children possess, seeing straight through the adult complications to the simple truth underneath. Clara realized that her discomfort with the portrait had been more obvious than she had thought, that her feelings were affecting the children she was trying to protect. "The picture is beautiful," Clara said, choosing her words carefully. "Your daddy wanted to do something nice for me, and that was very thoughtful. Sometimes when people try to show us they care, it can bring up feelings we weren't expecting." Ella seemed to consider this for a moment, her young mind working through the idea that gifts could be complicated, that good intentions could sometimes cause pain. "Maybe you could tell Daddy about the feelings," she suggested with the straightforward problem-solving approach of childhood. "When I have feelings about something, you always tell me to use my words." Clara smiled despite herself. Here was a 7-year-old offering relationship advice, using the very lessons Clara had taught her about communication and emotional honesty. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the wisdom in Ella's suggestion. But the conversation that needed to happen between Clara and George never took place. Both adults were trapped in their own interpretations of the situation, neither quite brave enough to bridge the gap that had opened between them. George continued to believe that time would heal whatever hurt Clara was feeling, that his gesture would eventually be appreciated as it was meant to be. Clara continued to feel that her grief had been misunderstood and displayed in ways that trivialized her genuine loss. Instead of clearing the air, they allowed the misunderstanding to fester, each retreat into formality reinforcing the distance between them. The house that had been growing warmer and more alive throughout the fall began to feel cold again, despite Clara's continued efforts to maintain a loving environment for the children. It was during this time of growing tension that the first seeds of real trouble were planted. George had hired a new housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, an efficient woman who came with excellent references and a stern manner that reminded him of his own childhood nanny. Mrs. Patterson was everything Clara was not: formal, distant, concerned with cleanliness and order rather than emotional connection. She performed her duties with mechanical precision, treating the house like a machine to be maintained rather than a home to be nurtured. From the beginning, Mrs. Patterson viewed Clara with suspicion and barely concealed resentment. She saw Clara's close relationship with the children as unprofessional, her musical activities as frivolous distractions from proper child care, her easy laughter and Spanish lullabies as inappropriate in a household of this caliber. Mrs. Patterson represented the old-fashioned approach to domestic service: invisible, interchangeable, strictly professional. Clara's obvious importance to the family, her integral role in their emotional well-being, threatened everything Mrs. Patterson believed about proper boundaries between servants and employers. Mrs. Patterson began a subtle campaign of undermining, commenting to George about the noise levels during music lessons, questioning whether Clara was maintaining appropriate discipline with the children, suggesting that perhaps the household would benefit from more structure and less indulgence. She never made direct accusations, but her implications were clear. Clara was overstepping her bounds, becoming too attached, forgetting her place in the household hierarchy. These suggestions fell on fertile ground because George was already feeling unsettled about his relationship with Clara, already wondering if he had made mistakes in judgment. Mrs. Patterson's comments seemed to confirm his growing suspicion that the informality that had developed over the past months might not have been appropriate, that perhaps he had allowed boundaries to blur in ways that were ultimately harmful to everyone involved. The poison worked slowly but effectively. George began to notice things he had previously overlooked: the way Clara's eyes would linger on the portrait with an expression he couldn't read, the way she sometimes seemed sad even when surrounded by the children's laughter, the way she had pulled back from the easy conversations they had been having about family life and the children's growth. Instead of seeing these as signs that his gift had hurt her, he began to interpret them as evidence that Clara was becoming too emotionally involved, too proprietary about her role in the family. Mrs. Patterson continued her campaign through the winter and into early spring, always careful to present her concerns as motivated by pure professional worry. She spoke about the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries, about the dangers of household staff becoming too familiar with their employers, about the confusion that could arise when job descriptions became unclear. She never directly criticized Clara's childcare abilities. Those were clearly excellent. But she planted doubts about the appropriateness of Clara's methods, the wisdom of allowing so much emotional intimacy between a nanny and the children she cared for. The breaking point came on a rainy April evening when George returned home early from a business dinner to find what Mrs. Patterson would later describe as a scene of complete unprofessionalism. In reality, it was nothing more than Clara reading bedtime stories to Ella and Jamie in George's bedroom, the three of them tucked together under a blanket while rain drummed against the windows. The children had been frightened by thunder, and Clara had brought them to the master bedroom because it felt safer and more comforting than their individual rooms. But through Mrs. Patterson's eyes, this innocent scene became evidence of Clara overstepping fundamental boundaries, making herself too comfortable in spaces that belonged to the family rather than the staff. When she reported the incident to George the following morning, she painted it as a violation of basic professional protocol, a sign that Clara no longer understood her proper role in the household. George, already primed by months of subtle conditioning and his own misgivings about the emotional complexity of his relationship with Clara, saw the scene through Mrs. Patterson's interpretation rather than trusting his own eyes. Instead of recognizing a nanny comforting frightened children, he saw an employee who had forgotten her place, who had perhaps become too comfortable with privileges that weren't hers to claim. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and devastating. George called Clara into his office on a Friday morning in late April, his manner formal and distant in a way that reminded her of their earliest interactions. Mrs. Patterson had suggested that she be present as a witness, ostensibly for professional protocol, but really to ensure that Clara couldn't defend herself effectively. "Clara, I think we need to discuss some concerns about your performance," George began, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had developed between them over the past year. "It's been brought to my attention that you may be overstepping some boundaries in your role here." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. After 5 years of devoted service, after the trust that had built between them following Jamie's illness, after the music lessons and family dinners and shared stories, she was suddenly being treated like a stranger, like someone who had violated some fundamental trust. "I don't understand," she said, her voice steady despite the shock she felt. "What boundaries? Have I done something wrong with the children?" Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her expression stern and disapproving. "Mr. Carmichael, perhaps I should explain. Yesterday evening I found Clara in your bedroom with the children, all of them on your bed reading stories. It seemed highly inappropriate for staff to make themselves so comfortable in such private family spaces." The words hit Clara like physical blows. The tender moment she had shared with Ella and Jamie, comforting them during a thunderstorm, was being twisted into evidence of professional misconduct. The trust she had built, the love she had given, was being reinterpreted as overreach and impropriety. "The children were frightened," Clara said, looking directly at George, appealing to the connection she thought they had built. "Jamie was crying, and Ella couldn't sleep because of the thunder. I thought they would feel safer." "That's exactly the problem," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "You thought. You made decisions about family matters that weren't yours to make. There are appropriate ways to comfort children that don't involve making yourself at home in their father's bedroom." George watched this exchange with growing discomfort, but not the kind Clara had hoped for. Instead of defending her, instead of recognizing the love and care behind her actions, he found himself agreeing with Mrs. Patterson's interpretation. The emotional complexity of his relationship with Clara, the gratitude and guilt and confusion he felt about her role in the family, made it easier to retreat behind professional boundaries than to examine his own feelings. "Clara, I think Mrs. Patterson raises valid concerns," he said, his voice becoming more distant with each word. "Perhaps we've allowed the lines to become too blurred. You're an excellent nanny, but you need to remember that you're not. That is, you're an employee, not family." The words landed like a death blow. After 5 years of caring for his children, after sleepless nights during Jamie's illness, after sharing her most private grief and witnessing his family's growth and healing, Clara was being reduced to her job description. The man who had thanked her for saving his son's life who had listened to her stories about Miguel, who had seemed to understand her importance to his children's emotional development, was suddenly treating her like a stranger who had forgotten her place. "I see," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. The dignity that had carried her through poverty and loss and years of invisible service held her upright, but inside she felt something breaking that she wasn't sure could ever be repaired. "I think it would be best if you found other employment," George continued, the words coming easier now that he had started, as if solving a business problem rather than destroying a human relationship. "I'll provide excellent references, of course, and a generous severance package, but I think we all need some space to reassess appropriate boundaries." Clara nodded once, a sharp movement that contained all the grief and dignity she could manage. She didn't trust herself to speak, didn't think she could maintain her composure if she tried to defend herself or plead for understanding. Instead, she simply said, "I'll pack my things and be gone by this evening." She turned and walked out of the office, past Mrs. Patterson's satisfied expression, past the portrait of her grief that hung on the living room wall, past the piano where she had shared so much music and love with children who had become the center of her world. She could hear Ella practicing scales upstairs, could hear Jamie singing to himself in his playroom, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out with the pain of losing them. In her small third-floor room, Clara packed her few possessions with mechanical precision. 5 years of her life fit into 2 small suitcases and a shopping bag. She folded her simple dresses, packed her worn shoes, carefully wrapped the small photo of Roberto that she kept on her nightstand. At the bottom of one suitcase, she placed the sheet music she had been collecting for Ella and Jamie, pieces she had planned to teach them as they grew older, songs that would now go unlearned. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the children. Ella found her first attracted by the unusual activity in Clara's room. When she saw the packed suitcases, her face went white with understanding and fear. "You're leaving," Ella said, not a question, but a statement of devastating fact. "Why are you leaving us?" Clara knelt down to Ella's level, taking the child's hands in her own weathered ones. She had promised herself she wouldn't make this harder by crying, but seeing Ella's stricken expression nearly broke her resolve. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions," Clara said, using the same gentle voice she had always used to explain life's complications to the children. "Your daddy thinks it would be better if I found a different job." "But we need you," Ella said, her 7-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Who will teach me piano? Who will make Jamie stop having nightmares? Who will sing the butterfly song when I'm sad?" Each question was a knife in Clara's heart, but she kept her voice steady. "You'll be fine, mija. You're both strong and smart and full of love, and you'll always have the music inside you, no matter who teaches you new songs." Jamie appeared in the doorway, drawn by voices he couldn't understand but sensed were important. When he saw Clara's suitcases, he toddled over and wrapped his small arms around her legs with the possessive love of a 3-year-old who doesn't understand why important people sometimes disappear. "No go, Clara," he said, his vocabulary limited but his meaning perfectly clear. "Stay here, play piano." Clara lifted him into her arms one last time, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair, feeling the solid weight of his small body against her chest. She had helped teach him to walk, had been there for his first words, had sung him to sleep countless nights. He was as much her child as if she had given birth to him, and leaving him felt like tearing out part of her own heart. "Be good for your daddy," she whispered to both children, her voice finally beginning to crack. "Remember that someone loves you very much, even when you can't see her anymore." She set Jamie down gently and picked up her suitcases, walking toward the stairs with the measured pace of someone who knows that running would accomplish nothing. Behind her she could hear Ella beginning to cry and Jamie calling her name in confusion and distress. She didn't look back, knowing that seeing their faces would break what was left of her composure. George was in his office when Clara walked past, but he didn't come out to say goodbye. Through the open door, she could see him at his desk, staring at financial reports with the concentrated attention of someone trying very hard not to think about something else. Mrs. Patterson was nowhere to be seen, having accomplished her purpose and retreated to enjoy her victory in private. Clara walked out of the Carmichael mansion and into the gray San Francisco afternoon, leaving behind 5 years of love and devotion and the closest thing to a family she had known since Roberto's death. The fog was rolling in from the bay, wrapping around the city's hills like a cold embrace, and Clara pulled her thin jacket closer as she walked toward the bus stop that would take her back to her old neighborhood. Back to the small apartment she had kept as a refuge she never thought she would need. The house that Clara left behind felt immediately and profoundly different, as if someone had turned down the volume on life itself. Mrs. Patterson moved through the rooms with efficient satisfaction, implementing the structured routines she believed were more appropriate for children of the Carmichael family's social standing. Meals were served at precisely scheduled times, educational activities replaced musical exploration, and the easy laughter that had filled the mansion's rooms was replaced by the quiet order that Mrs. Patterson considered properly professional. But children cannot be managed like business portfolios, and Ella and Jamie's grief over Clara's disappearance could not be organized away. Ella stopped playing piano altogether, claiming she had forgotten how, though her small hands would sometimes move unconsciously across imaginary keys when she thought no one was watching. Jamie reverted to the tantrums and sleep disturbances that Clara had patiently helped him overcome, crying for Clara music in the middle of the night, until Mrs. Patterson's stern discipline finally taught him that such outbursts were unacceptable. George watched his children's distress with growing unease, but he had committed himself to the belief that professional boundaries were more important than emotional attachments. When Mrs. Patterson reported that the children were adjusting to the new routine, he chose to interpret their withdrawal and sadness as natural adaptation rather than genuine loss. It was easier to trust in professional protocols than to examine whether he had made a terrible mistake. The house itself seemed to rebel against Clara's absence. The piano bench sat empty and somehow accusatory, gathering dust in the living room where music had once brought the family together each evening. The kitchen, where Clara had hummed while preparing meals infused with love and cultural richness, fell silent, except for the mechanical sounds of Mrs. Patterson's efficiently prepared but soulless dinners. Even the garden Clara had planted with the children began to wither, as if it understood that the loving hands that had tended it were gone forever. As the weeks turned into months, George found himself working longer hours, staying at the office until well past the children's bedtime. Coming home had once been a source of joy, a return to warmth and laughter and the easy rhythms of family life that Clara had helped create. Now the mansion felt like exactly what it had always been before Clara's influence, a beautiful, expensive, emotionally empty showcase where people lived side by side without truly connecting. Mrs. Patterson maintained order with military precision, but she could not replace what Clara had brought to the family. The children were fed and bathed and dressed appropriately. Their schedules were maintained and their basic needs met, but something essential was missing. The spark of joy that had animated both Ella and Jamie during Clara's tenure had dimmed to a barely perceptible flicker. Ella's grades at school began to slip as she lost interest in learning, and her teacher expressed concern about her withdrawal from social activities. Jamie's preschool reported behavioral problems and regression in his development, noting that he seemed anxious and prone to crying fits that had not been issues in previous months. Both children asked for Clara constantly during the first weeks after her dismissal, but Mrs. Patterson's stern responses eventually taught them that such questions were unwelcome. George received these reports about his children's struggles with increasing distress, but he had painted himself into a corner with his decision to fire Clara. Acknowledging that the children's problems might be related to her absence would require admitting that he had made a serious error in judgment, something his pride made difficult to accept. Instead, he hired child psychologists and educational consultants, spending thousands of dollars on professional advice about issues that might have been resolved with a simple phone call to the woman who understood his children better than anyone. The portrait that had started the rift between George and Clara still hung in the living room, but now it seemed to mock rather than honor. The angelic representation of Miguel watching over Clara as she cared for other children had become a painful reminder of the misunderstanding that had driven away the woman it was meant to celebrate. George found himself avoiding the living room, unable to face the painted eyes that seemed to follow him with accusation rather than blessing. As autumn settled over San Francisco, bringing with it the anniversary of some of Clara's happiest moments with the family, George began to experience something he hadn't felt since the early days after Margaret's death, genuine regret that kept him awake at night. The financial reports that had once commanded his complete attention seemed increasingly meaningless compared to the emptiness that had settled over his home. His investment portfolio continued to grow. Bitcoin reached new heights, his stock positions generated substantial profits, his net worth increased by millions, but wealth felt hollow when measured against his children's unhappiness. It was Ella who finally forced George to confront the magnitude of his mistake. On a cold October evening, almost 6 months after Clara's dismissal, George found his daughter sitting alone at the silent piano, her small fingers resting on keys she no longer played. She looked so small and lost in the large room, so different from the confident, joyful child she'd been during Clara's time with the family. "Ella," George said softly, approaching her carefully. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" She looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8 years, eyes that held a sadness that broke his heart. "I was trying to remember the butterfly song," she said in a small voice. "Clara used to sing it when I was scared, but I can't remember how it goes." George sat down beside her on the piano bench, the same bench where Clara had spent so many evenings teaching his children about music and love and the healing power of melody. The keys were dusty from months of disuse, and the silence around them felt heavy with loss. "Maybe I could help you remember," George said, though he knew he couldn't. He had never learned the songs Clara had shared with his children, had never taken the time to understand the musical language she had used to communicate love and comfort. Ella shook her head, a gesture filled with resignation that no 8-year-old should possess. "You don't know it," she said with matter-of-fact sadness. "Only Clara knew it, and now she's gone, and I'll never remember it, and when I'm scared there won't be anyone to sing it to me." The simple honesty of her words hit George like a physical blow. In trying to maintain professional boundaries, he had robbed his daughter of something irreplaceable: the songs that had been her security, the voice that had been her comfort, the presence that had made her feel safe in a world that had already taken her mother. Clara's dismissal hadn't protected his children from inappropriate attachment. It had torn away a source of healing love they desperately needed. "Ella," George said, his voice heavy with a regret he could no longer deny. "Would you like me to try to find Clara? Would you like to see her again?" For the first time in months, genuine hope flickered in Ella's eyes. "Could you?" she asked, afraid to believe it might be possible. "Could we ask her to come back? I promise I'll be good. I promise I won't make any noise when she plays piano." George realized then how complete his failure had been. His daughter thought Clara had left because of something she had done wrong, thought the silence and withdrawal in their home was somehow her fault. The professional boundaries he had been so concerned about maintaining had created a wound in his children's hearts that no amount of money or proper protocol could heal. That night, after Ella and Jamie were finally asleep, George sat in his office staring at financial documents he couldn't focus on. The numbers that usually commanded his complete attention seemed meaningless compared to the recognition of what he had lost. Clara hadn't been just an employee who had overstepped her bounds. She had been the heart of his family, the source of healing and joy that had brought life back to a house hollowed by grief. Mrs. Patterson's efficiency couldn't replace Clara's intuitive understanding of his children's needs. Professional childcare protocols couldn't substitute for the deep well of love and experience that Clara had brought to every interaction with Ella and Jamie. He had traded something precious and irreplaceable for something proper and sterile, and his children were paying the price for his mistake. The search for Clara began the next morning, but it proved more difficult than George had anticipated. She had left no forwarding address, had apparently dissolved her connections to the family completely. The employment agency that had originally recommended her had lost touch with her after her dismissal, and the few personal references she had provided years earlier led to dead ends. Clara Martinez had vanished into the sprawling anonymity of San Francisco as thoroughly as if she had never existed. George hired a private investigator, spending more money in a week than Clara's annual salary to track down a woman whose value he had failed to recognize until it was too late. But Clara had retreated into the working-class neighborhoods south of the city, places where people knew how to become invisible when necessary, where questions about missing persons were met with protective silence. Meanwhile, the Carmichael house continued its slow slide back into the emotional emptiness that had characterized it before Clara's arrival. Mrs. Patterson maintained order with increasing rigidity, perhaps sensing that her position depended on proving that her methods were superior to Clara's warm, but supposedly unprofessional approach. The children's meals were nutritionally balanced but flavorless. Their schedules were perfectly organized but joyless. Their care was adequate but loveless. Jamie stopped asking for Clara music after Mrs. Patterson made it clear that such requests resulted in immediate punishment, but he would sometimes hum tunelessly to himself, creating melodies that seemed to echo with the ghost of lullabies he could no longer fully remember. Ella completed her homework and practiced piano scales with mechanical precision, but the creativity and joy that had characterized her musical development under Clara's guidance were gone, replaced by rote learning that satisfied Mrs. Patterson's standards but nurtured nothing in the child's soul. Christmas approached with a silence that felt like mourning. In previous years, Clara had filled the house with the warm traditions of her heritage, teaching the children about Las Posadas and sharing the foods and songs of her childhood while respecting the family's own holiday customs. The celebration that resulted had been rich with cultural exchange and genuine family warmth, a blending of traditions that honored both Clara's background and the children's memories of their mother. This year, Mrs. Patterson organized a Christmas that was picture-perfect and emotionally barren. The tree was professionally decorated, the gifts were expensive and age-appropriate, the holiday meal was expertly prepared and properly served. But there was no music beyond recorded carols played at appropriate volume levels, no stories shared around the fireplace, no sense of joy or celebration or family connection. The children opened their presents with polite appreciation, but no real excitement. Their faces reflecting the emotional emptiness that had settled over their home, like fog rolling in from the bay. It was during this hollow Christmas celebration that George finally understood the full magnitude of what he had destroyed. Watching his children go through the motions of holiday joy without actually experiencing any, seeing their careful politeness where there had once been spontaneous laughter, recognizing the absence of the warmth and cultural richness that Clara had brought to every celebration, George realized that he had not protected his family by firing Clara. He had wounded them in ways that might never fully heal. The new year brought renewed determination to his search efforts, but also a growing fear that Clara might be lost to them forever. 6 months had passed since her dismissal. 6 months during which she could have found new employment, could have built new connections, could have decided that the Carmichael family was a chapter of her life she preferred to close. George began to understand that even if he found Clara, she might not be willing to return to a household that had rejected her so completely, that had chosen suspicion over trust and protocol over love. But love doesn't disappear simply because it's inconvenient or professionally inappropriate. The bonds Clara had forged with Ella and Jamie during 5 years of devoted care couldn't be severed by employment termination, couldn't be replaced by more suitable arrangements. The children's grief over her absence was proof of the depth of connection that had existed, evidence of a relationship that transcended job descriptions and challenged conventional boundaries between family and staff. As winter gave way to spring in San Francisco, the private investigator finally found a lead. Clara had been spotted in a small cafe in the Mission District, the neighborhood where she had lived before joining the Carmichael family, where the smell of fresh tortillas and the sound of Spanish conversations created an atmosphere of home for immigrants and their children. She was working as a server, taking orders and clearing tables with the same quiet dignity she had brought to her duties as a nanny, but her eyes held a sadness that seemed to have settled permanently into the lines of her face. The investigator's report included a photograph that broke George's heart. Clara, in her server's uniform, her graying hair pulled back as it had always been, her hands still careful and graceful as she carried a tray of coffee cups. She looked older than when she had left the Carmichael house, worn down by months of grief and displacement, but her bearing still carried the dignity that had always defined her. She was surviving, but she was no longer thriving, no longer the source of joy and music she had been when surrounded by children who loved her. George realized that finding Clara was only the first step in a much more difficult journey. He had to find a way to approach her that acknowledged the pain he had caused, that recognized the injustice of her dismissal, that offered not just employment, but genuine apology and restoration of the respect she deserved. He had to find words that could bridge the gap between his earlier rejection and his current understanding, between the professional boundaries he had insisted upon and the family connection he now recognized she had always represented. But most importantly, he had to find the courage to admit that he had been wrong, that his judgment had been flawed, that his children's nanny had been worth more than all his careful protocols and professional standards. The man who had built a fortune through decisive action and unwavering confidence in his own judgment now faced the hardest task of his life, swallowing his pride and asking for forgiveness from a woman he had deeply wronged. The Mission District Cafe where Clara worked was a world away from the elegant restaurants and high-end establishments George usually frequented. The walls were painted bright colors and decorated with folk art. The air was filled with the sounds of conversations in Spanish and English, and the customers were working-class families and immigrants rather than tech executives and investment professionals. It was a warm, authentic place where people came not just for food, but for community, for the sense of belonging that money couldn't buy. George felt conspicuously out of place in his expensive suit and polished shoes, aware that his wealth and privilege were as visible as a neon sign in this neighborhood where people worked multiple jobs to pay rent and sent money back to relatives in other countries. But his discomfort paled beside his nervousness about seeing Clara again, about facing the woman he had dismissed so coldly and asking for a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. He spotted her behind the counter, taking an order from an elderly man who spoke to her in rapid Spanish. Clara responded with the same patient kindness she had always shown, listening carefully to his request and offering suggestions with a warmth that transformed the simple transaction into a moment of human connection. Watching her work, George was reminded of the grace she had brought to every interaction with his children, the way she had made ordinary moments feel special through the simple application of attention and care. When Clara finally noticed him sitting alone at a corner table, her face went through a complex series of emotions: surprise, wariness, and something that might have been pain. She finished serving her customer and approached George's table with measured steps, her professional server's smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Mr. Carmichael," she said formally, her voice carrying none of the warmth he remembered. "What can I get for you?" The polite distance in her tone was like a slap, a reminder of how completely he had severed the connection between them. This was not the Clara who had shared stories about Miguel, who had laughed with his children, who had become an integral part of his family's daily life. This was a woman protecting herself from further hurt, maintaining professional boundaries with someone who had shown her that personal connection was dangerous. "Clara," George said, his voice carrying a weight of regret he could no longer contain. "I didn't come here for coffee. I came to talk to you, to apologize, to ask if there's any possibility that you could forgive me for the terrible mistake I made." Clara's expression didn't change, but George saw her hands tighten slightly on the order pad she was carrying. a subtle sign that his words were affecting her despite her careful control. Around them, the cafe continued its warm buzz of conversation and clinking dishes, but George felt as if they were enclosed in a bubble of tense silence. "I'm working," Clara said simply, "and I don't think we have anything to talk about. You made your feelings about my service very clear when you asked me to leave." The formal politeness of her response was more painful than anger would have been. Anger would have suggested that she still cared enough to feel hurt. This careful distance suggested that she had moved beyond hurt to acceptance, that she had written off the Carmichael family as completely as they had once dismissed her. "Please," George said, and the word came out more desperately than he had intended. "Just 5 minutes. Let me explain what happened. Let me tell you how wrong I was." Clara looked around the cafe, perhaps checking with her supervisor or considering her other customers, but more likely buying time to decide whether this conversation was worth the emotional risk. Finally, she nodded toward a small table near the window where they could talk more privately. 5 minutes, she said, settling into the chair across from him with the careful posture of someone prepared to leave at the first sign of trouble. "Say what you came to say." George had rehearsed this conversation countless times during the months of searching for her, had imagined different scenarios and prepared various approaches. But faced with Clara's guarded expression and formal politeness, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. How could he explain the complexity of factors that had led to her dismissal without sounding like he was making excuses? How could he convey the depth of his regret without seeming to minimize the pain he had caused? "The children miss you," he began, because that was the most important truth and the one he hoped might reach her heart. "Ella hasn't played piano since you left. Jamie still asks for Clara music in his sleep. They ask about you every day, and I don't know what to tell them anymore." Something flickered in Clara's eyes at the mention of the children, a softening that suggested her protective walls weren't completely impenetrable. But she quickly controlled her expression, returning to the careful neutrality she had maintained since recognizing him. "Children adapt," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm sure Mrs. Patterson takes good care of them." "Mrs. Patterson keeps them fed and clean and on schedule," George said, the words coming more easily now that he was talking about his children's needs rather than his own guilt. "But she doesn't know that Jamie needs the butterfly song when he has nightmares. She doesn't know that Ella learns better when lessons feel like games. She doesn't know how to make them laugh or help them understand their feelings, or teach them that it's okay to be sad sometimes." Clara's careful composure wavered slightly, and George saw her hands tremble before she folded them tightly in her lap. These were the details of daily life that she had managed with intuitive skill, the small but crucial ways she had nurtured his children's emotional development. No one else would ever know these things about Ella and Jamie unless Clara taught them, and she was the only person who had cared enough to learn them in the first place. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked, her voice softer now but still guarded. "Why are you here, Mr. Carmichael? What do you want from me?" This was the moment George had been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. Everything he said next would determine whether there was any possibility of healing the damage he had caused, whether his family could ever recover what they had lost. He took a deep breath and chose honesty over pride. "I want you to come back," he said simply. "I want you to forgive me for listening to the wrong person, for doubting your devotion to my children, for being too proud and stupid to recognize what you meant to our family. I want to undo the worst mistake I've ever made." Clara stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine or just another manipulation. The years of service, of love given and not adequately returned, of being treated as less than family despite her devotion, had taught her to be cautious about trusting the promises of wealthy employers. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "You didn't just fire me, Mr. Carmichael. You humiliated me. You listened to someone who had known me for a few months instead of trusting your own experience with me over 5 years. You reduced me to a job description after I had given your family my whole heart." George felt each word like a physical blow, recognizing the accuracy of her accusations. He had betrayed not just their professional relationship, but the personal trust that had developed between them, the sense of mutual respect and understanding that had made Clara feel like part of the family rather than hired help. "You're right," he said, abandoning any attempt at self-justification. "Everything you're saying is true. I was wrong, and I hurt you, and I don't know how to make up for that except to ask you to give me a chance to try." Clara was quiet for several moments, her gaze turning toward the window where afternoon sunshine illuminated the busy street outside. George could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, the desire to protect herself from further hurt, warring with what he hoped was still some remaining love for his children. "The children you described," she said slowly. "They don't sound happy." "They're not," George admitted. "The house feels like a museum now. There's no laughter, no music, no joy. They go through the motions of childhood, but they're not really living. They're waiting for something. And I think they're waiting for you." This seemed to affect Clara more than anything else he had said. Her professional composure finally cracked, and George saw tears begin to gather in her eyes. Whatever anger or disappointment she felt toward him, her love for Ella and Jamie remained undiminished. "They shouldn't have to suffer because of decisions adults made," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Children should have music and laughter and people who understand them." "Come back," George said again, leaning forward across the small table. "Not for me, but for them. They need you, Clara. I need you. We all need you to help us remember how to be a family again." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded George of countless times she had dried his children's tears with the same gentle motion. She was crying for Ella and Jamie, for the months of their unhappiness, for the music that had been silenced, and the joy that had been lost. "If I came back," she said carefully, "things would have to be different. I can't go back to being treated like I'm not important, like my feelings don't matter, like I could be dismissed again the moment someone decides I'm inconvenient." "Name your terms," George said immediately. "Whatever you want, whatever you need, to feel secure and respected. I'll put it in writing. I'll give you a contract that protects you from ever being dismissed without cause again." Clara shook her head, surprising him. "It's not about contracts or money," she said. "It's about trust. It's about being seen as a human being with feelings and opinions that matter. It's about being treated like family, because that's what I was to those children, even if you couldn't see it." George felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of truth that was both painful and liberating. Clara wasn't just asking for job security. She was asking to be valued for who she was, not just what she could do. She was asking for the respect and dignity that should have been hers from the beginning, the acknowledgement that her love for his children was real and valuable and worthy of protection. "You were family," he said, his voice rough with emotion he had been holding back for months. "You are family. I was too blind to see it, but you were the one holding us all together. You were the heart of our home, and when I let you go, I tore our family apart." Clara studied his face for a long moment, perhaps looking for signs of sincerity, perhaps trying to decide if she could trust him not to hurt her again. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I'll come back," she said, "but not as your employee, as your children's guardian, as a member of your family, as someone whose opinion matters when decisions are made about their care." "Yes," George said immediately, "whatever you want, however you want to define it." Clara smiled for the first time since he had entered the cafe, and the expression transformed her face, bringing back the warmth and light that had been missing for so many months. "Then let's go home," she said. "I think the children have waited long enough." The reunion between Clara and the children was everything George had hoped for, and more than he had dared to imagine. When Clara walked through the front door of the Carmichael mansion, Ella was practicing piano scales in the living room with mechanical precision, her small fingers moving across the keys with technical accuracy, but no emotional engagement. The sound of the door opening made her look up. And when she saw Clara standing in the entryway, she froze for a moment as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "Clara, Ella's voice was barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might make the vision disappear. "Is it really you?" "Sí, mija," Clara said, opening her arms wide. "I'm home." Ella flew across the room and into Clara's embrace, with enough force to nearly knock her over, wrapping her thin arms around Clara's waist and burying her face against her shoulder. The careful composure she had maintained for months finally cracked, and she began to sob with the intensity of grief finally allowed expression. "I thought you were never coming back," Ella cried, her words muffled against Clara's shoulder. "I thought I did something wrong and you left forever and I forgot all the songs and I couldn't remember how the butterfly song goes, and Mrs. Patterson said I had to stop crying and be a big girl, but I missed you so much." Clara held her close, stroking her hair and murmuring comfort in the mixture of English and Spanish that Ella had always found so soothing. "Shh, Amr, I'm here now. You didn't do anything wrong. Nothing that happened was your fault, and I never forgot about you, not for one single day." Jamie appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by his sister's crying, and when he saw Clara holding Ella, he let out a shriek of joy that echoed through the mansion's halls. He tumbled down the stairs with reckless 3-year-old enthusiasm and threw himself at Clara's legs, holding on as if he would never let go. "Clara music!" he shouted, his vocabulary limited but his meaning perfectly clear. "Clara music back! Sing Butterfly song!" Clara laughed through her own tears, kneeling down to gather both children in her arms. This was what she had missed most during the long months of exile. The weight of their small bodies against her own, the sound of their voices saying her name with love and trust, the feeling of being needed and wanted by these precious souls she had helped to nurture. "Yes, mi niño, I'll sing all the songs," she promised Jamie. "We'll play piano and sing butterflies and make music every single day." George watched this reunion from the doorway, his own eyes filling with tears at the sight of his children's raw joy and relief. Mrs. Patterson appeared behind him, her expression stern with disapproval at the emotional display. But George no longer cared about her opinions on appropriate behavior. His children were happy for the first time in months, alive in a way they hadn't been since Clara's departure, and that was worth more than all the professional protocols in the world. That evening, for the first time since Clara had been dismissed, music filled the Carmichael house again. Clara sat at the piano with both children pressed close against her sides, teaching them new songs and helping them remember old ones. Her voice, warm and gentle, wove melodies that seemed to chase away months of silence and sadness, filling the empty spaces with love and laughter. They played the butterfly song that had haunted Ella's dreams, the construction truck song that made Jamie giggle, and half a dozen lullabies in Spanish that both children had missed without fully understanding why. Clara's hands moved across the keys with the same grace they had always possessed, but now her playing carried an added depth of emotion, as if the months of separation had refined her understanding of music's power to heal. George sat nearby, not participating but absorbing the warmth and connection that had returned to his family. He watched Clara's patient instruction, saw how she encouraged each child's individual musical expression while teaching them to blend their voices in harmony. This was what he had almost lost forever, not just a skilled caregiver, but a woman whose love and wisdom had shaped his children's understanding of joy and beauty and connection. Mrs. Patterson lasted exactly 1 day after Clara's return. The contrast between her rigid efficiency and Clara's warm competence was too stark to ignore, and more importantly, the children made it clear through their behavior which caregiver they preferred. Faced with Clara's obvious mastery of child development and the family's evident happiness with her methods, Mrs. Patterson chose to seek employment elsewhere, complaining to anyone who would listen about households where professional standards were compromised by excessive emotional attachment. But Clara's return wasn't just about resuming old routines. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Carmichael family's story. George had learned something during the months of his children's unhappiness, something about the difference between providing for a family and nurturing one, between ensuring security and creating joy. He began to participate more actively in the musical evenings, even attempting to learn piano himself despite his complete lack of natural talent. Clara was patient with his clumsy efforts, just as she was patient with everything else that required teaching and growth. But more importantly, she helped him understand the deeper lessons that music could offer, about the value of practice and persistence, about the beauty that could emerge from mistakes, about the joy of creating something beautiful with people you love. The portrait that had caused so much misunderstanding still hung in the living room, but its meaning had evolved. George asked Clara about it one evening, wondering if it still caused her pain, offering to remove it if she preferred. "No," Clara said, studying the painted image of herself with Miguel watching from among the clouds. "It's not wrong, exactly. Miguel is watching over all the children I love, helping me take care of them. The artist just didn't understand that Miguel isn't watching from far away. He's right here, in every song I teach, every lullaby I sing, every moment of love I share." George began to understand then that his earlier gesture hadn't been wrong in intent, only in execution. The portrait honored Clara's capacity to love, but it had failed to recognize that her grief wasn't something decorative or distant. It was a living part of her, woven into her daily interactions with the children she cared for, expressed through her music and her gentle wisdom about life's sorrows and joys. As the seasons changed and the Carmichael family settled into new rhythms that honored both structure and spontaneity, both security and joy, George found himself reflecting on the business lesson he had learned through nearly losing Clara. In his professional life, he was skilled at recognizing value, investments that would appreciate, companies with strong growth potential, market opportunities that others might overlook. But he had almost failed to recognize the most valuable asset in his personal life, a woman whose love and dedication had enriched his family beyond any measure that money could calculate. Clara's financial compensation increased significantly upon her return, but more importantly, her role in the household was redefined to reflect her true importance to the family's well-being. She was no longer just a nanny. She was director of child development, with authority over educational decisions and input on all matters affecting the children's welfare. The title change might have seemed symbolic to outsiders, but to Clara, it represented recognition of her expertise and acknowledgement of her importance to the family's functioning. The children flourished under this new arrangement, their happiness and confidence growing as they felt the security of Clara's permanent place in their lives. Ella's piano playing evolved from mechanical practice to genuine artistic expression, and she began composing her own simple pieces with Clara's encouragement. Jamie's musical abilities developed rapidly, his natural rhythm and pitch recognition suggesting talents that might have gone undiscovered without Clara's nurturing guidance. But perhaps most importantly, both children learned from Clara's example about resilience, about the possibility of healing from hurt, about the power of forgiveness and second chances. They had witnessed their family break apart and come back together, had experienced loss and recovery, had seen that love could survive misunderstanding and emerge stronger than before. As Clara settled back into the rhythms of the Carmichael household, she brought with her a deeper understanding of her own worth and a clearer sense of boundaries that protected her emotionally while still allowing her to love freely. The months of separation had been painful, but they had also been educational, teaching her that her value didn't depend on other people's recognition, that her love for the children was precious regardless of how others might categorize their relationship. Years passed, and the Carmichael house remained filled with music and laughter, with the sounds of children growing and learning and becoming themselves under Clara's patient guidance. Ella developed into an accomplished pianist with ambitions to study music in college, while Jamie showed promise as both a musician and a composer, his early songs displaying the kind of emotional depth that Clara had always encouraged. George remarried eventually to a woman who understood and appreciated Clara's role in the family, who saw her not as a threat, but as a treasure to be valued. The new Mrs. Carmichael brought her own children to the household, and Clara's influence expanded to encompass an even larger family circle, her capacity for love seemingly unlimited. The portrait in the living room was eventually joined by others, photographs of family vacations that included Clara as a central figure, pictures of school performances and piano recitals where she beamed proudly from the audience, images that documented her integral role in the family's ongoing story. Miguel's presence remained woven through all of these moments, not as a distant angel, but as a living part of Clara's love, expressed through every child she nurtured and every song she shared. As Ella and Jamie grew into teenagers and then young adults, they never forgot the woman who had shaped their earliest understanding of love and music and family. They visited Clara regularly, even when their busy schedules pulled them in different directions, bringing her news of their accomplishments and seeking her advice during difficult times. The bonds forged during their childhood had proven unbreakable, surviving changes and challenges and the natural evolution of a family's dynamics. Clara aged gracefully in the Carmichael house, her hair growing white but her spirit remaining strong, her hands developing arthritis but never losing their gentle touch. The children she had once cared for brought their own children to visit, introducing them to the remarkable woman who had taught their parents about music and love and the importance of family bonds that transcend blood relations. And through it all, the piano remained the heart of the household, its keys worn smooth by countless hands learning to create beauty, its bench the gathering place for family moments that would be treasured for generations. Clara's music had become the soundtrack of the Carmichael family's happiness, the melody that wove through their daily lives and connected them to each other and to the deeper rhythms of love and loss and renewal that define every human story. On quiet evenings when the house settled into peaceful contentment, Clara would sometimes play the old songs that Roberto had loved, the lullabies she had sung to Miguel, the melodies that carried her personal history and connected her past to her present. These moments were no longer marked by sadness, but by gratitude, for love that had been given and received, for chances at redemption and renewal, for the recognition that family is not defined by biology or employment contracts, but by the deeper bonds of care and commitment and daily choice to love. George would listen to these evening concerts with a heart full of appreciation for the remarkable woman who had saved his family in more ways than one, who had taught his children about music and life and the possibility of healing from even the deepest wounds. The man who had once measured everything in terms of profit and loss had learned to recognize wealth of a different kind, the richness of a home filled with love, the treasure of children who felt secure and valued, the priceless gift of a woman whose presence had transformed a house into a true family sanctuary. And in the quiet moments between songs, when Clara's hands rested on the piano keys and the house hummed with contentment, everyone who had been touched by her love understood that they had witnessed something rare and beautiful, the power of one person's devotion to heal wounds, bridge differences, and create lasting bonds that would endure long after the music faded. Clara Martinez lived to be 87 years old, surrounded to the very end by the extended family she had helped to create and nurture through decades of patient love and unwavering devotion. When she finally went to sleep for the last time, her hands were holding the hands of grown children who had never stopped calling her their guardian angel, and the last sound she heard was the gentle melody of a lullaby being hummed by voices she had taught to sing. At her funeral, the church was filled with music, children's choirs from the schools where she had volunteered, professional musicians whose careers she had inspired, and family members whose lives had been shaped by her example. The service was a celebration of a life that had touched countless others, a recognition of love that had transcended professional boundaries and created connections that death itself could not sever. Ella, now a respected music teacher herself, played Clara's favorite piece on the piano that had been transported from the Carmichael house for the service. Jamie, who had become a successful composer, premiered a symphony he had written in Clara's honor, its movements reflecting the various stages of her life: immigration and loss, love and dedication, dismissal and pain, restoration and joy. George, now an elderly man himself, stood to speak about the woman who had taught his family about the difference between existing and truly living, between providing and nurturing, between employing someone and welcoming them into your heart. His words were simple but profound, acknowledging that Clara's greatest gift had not been her skill as a caregiver, but her capacity to love without reservation, to give without counting the cost, to find joy in the success and happiness of others. Clara taught us that family is not about blood relations or legal documents, George said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded church. Family is about showing up every day with love in your heart, about choosing to care for others even when it's difficult, about creating bonds that survive misunderstanding and grow stronger through forgiveness. She showed us that the most important wealth is not what you accumulate in bank accounts, but what you create in the hearts of people who love you. The memorial service was followed by a celebration at the Carmichael house, where the piano remained the centerpiece of the gathering. Children and grandchildren who had learned their first songs at Clara's side took turns playing her favorite pieces, sharing memories of music lessons and lullabies, of comfort given during difficult times and joy shared during celebrations. As the sun set over San Francisco Bay, painting the sky in the warm colors that Clara had always loved, the family she had created through love and devotion gathered around the piano one last time. They played her favorite songs and sang the lullabies she had taught them, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to carry her spirit with them, rising into the evening air like prayers made of music. And in that moment, everyone present understood that Clara's greatest achievement had not been her professional success or her recognition as an integral part of the Carmichael family, but the love she had sown and cultivated throughout her lifetime. That love lived on in every person she had touched, every child whose life had been enriched by her presence, every family bond she had helped to strengthen and heal. The butterfly song that Ella had once feared forgetting was now part of a musical legacy that would be passed down through generations, sung to children who had never met Clara, but who would benefit from her wisdom about the healing power of music and love. Jamie's compositions would carry echoes of the rhythms she had first taught him to recognize, melodies that honored both his own creativity and the woman who had nurtured it from its earliest beginnings. And somewhere in the music that continued to fill the Carmichael house long after Clara's physical presence had ended, those who listened carefully could hear the ghost of other songs: Roberto's guitar accompaniment, Miguel's joyful dancing, the voices of all the people Clara had loved throughout her remarkable life, joined together in a symphony that transcended death and celebrated the enduring power of a love that knows no boundaries. The legacy Clara left behind was not measured in dollars or professional achievements, but in lives transformed, hearts healed, and music that would continue to bring joy and comfort to future generations. She had taken the pain of her own losses and transformed it into a gift that enriched everyone she touched, proving that the deepest wounds can become the sources of our greatest strength, and that love freely given creates wealth that can never be diminished or lost. In the end, Clara Martinez had achieved something far more valuable than financial success or social status. She'd created a family not through birth or marriage, but through the daily choice to love, nurture, and believe in the potential of every person she encountered. Her true monument was not marble or bronze, but the living legacy of people who continued to love more deeply, give more freely, and create more beauty, because they had been touched by her remarkable spirit. And you, listening to this story from wherever you are, perhaps you recognize something of Clara in your own experience. Perhaps you've been the one caring for children who weren't yours, loving without recognition, giving your heart to a family that sometimes forgot to see you as more than hired help. Perhaps you felt the sting of dismissal, the pain of being treated as replaceable when you knew your love was unique and precious. If Clara's story resonates with you, Know that your love matters, your sacrifice is seen, and your devotion creates bonds that transcend job descriptions and employment contracts. The families you've touched, the children you've nurtured, the homes you've filled with warmth and care, these are your legacy, your contribution to a world that desperately needs more people who understand the transformative power of unconditional love. Maybe you've been on the other side of this dynamic, an employer who has taken for granted the women who have made your family life possible, who have failed to recognize the full humanity and precious worth of those who care for your children. Clara's story is an invitation to look more deeply, to see the people who serve your family not as interchangeable service providers, but as individuals with their own dreams, losses, and profound capacity to enrich your lives in ways you may never have imagined. Tell me your story in the comments below. Have you been the Clara in someone else's family? Have you been the George who learned too late to recognize true worth? Have you witnessed the power of love to bridge differences in class, culture, and circumstance? Share your experiences, because every story of recognition and redemption, of love transcending boundaries, adds to the symphony that Clara began. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe, ensuring that this message reaches another person who needs to hear it, another woman who deserves to feel seen and valued, another family that could benefit from understanding the difference between hiring help and welcoming love. For more stories that celebrate the quiet heroes among us, click the link to our special podcast series featuring tales of domestic workers, caregivers, and nannies whose devotion has transformed the families they've served. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us, for opening your hearts to Clara's story, and for carrying her legacy of love and music into your own lives. We'll meet again in our next story, where once more we'll explore the beautiful complexity of human relationships and the extraordinary people who make ordinary miracles possible every single day.